For our summer school Scottish seascapes, I'm going to take inspiration from two painters in particular, Francis Campbell Caddell and William McTAGGART, and I'm going to use these different approaches of these artists to devise a couple of exercises to start you off on the first 2 days. So McTAGGART, illustrated here, was a very expressive painter who worked wet in wet with substantial quantities of oil and captured the energy of the sea. He often created images with quite broken surfaces, building up thicker, lighter, brighter paint to capture all that movement. So for the first hour or so, on the first day when we're at Long Nidri Bents, I'm going to guide you in working on a small study, a postcard size piece of canvas, and I'm going to get you to work in a certain way that will reflect something of McTaggart's approach to painting. I'll encourage you to pre-mix some colours. So here I've mixed some colours, and I'll give you some notes, some guidance on some useful mixtures, but working with cerulean blue and black and white and some lemon yellow, some yellow ochre. I've put together a few mixtures which I'm now going to demonstrate the use of, and picking up on McTaggart's wet in wet approach of building up layers of paint. I'm going to do no drawing to start. I've tinted the canvas, and I'm going to work with this is a number 8 brush, so relative to the size of the postcard surface, it's fairly small, and I'm going to apply paint in broad strokes with the biggish brush before then going on to working with smaller brushes and also pieces of card with which I'm going to apply paint in more solid quantities. So I'll work a bit from dark to light. So I've just got a photograph here that I can work with. So I've tinted the canvas just with some brown, and I'm laying out something dark for really most of the distance, the distant horizon of my view. I've made something a bit lighter for the sky, so I'll maybe get that down as well. Working on this smaller surface with a big brush, I can quite quickly block in paint like this. In that way, I'll have an immediate structure to my painting, but I'll also have a wet surface that I can work with in such a way as to control the mixing of the paint. So there I've gone from my dark horizon colour to some slightly lighter colours coming towards the foreground. And then I'm going to put on a bit of colour for some sand. And then I'll go back with some other colours, some lighter colour. But by applying the paint on this small scale with this relatively large brush, I've got everything blocked in. That gives me a kind of structure and a coherence, which I can then begin to embellish and build up with variations. I'm changing to a slightly smaller brush. This is a number 1, a hog hair brush, and I'm going to put in some of the distant lands, the land of Fife, across the water. And because I'm painting wet in wet there, there's going to be some mixing. And either I want to float that new colour on top so that it doesn't mix, or I don't mind actually a little bit of the fading of that colour, but I can also top it up again if it's faded or mixed too much. So this is all about managing the mixing of wet in wet paint. And I wanted to sharpen up the horizon though. It's not too bad. But again, I'm using the number 1 brush and trying to get something slightly more definite. So in some instances, I'm using my pre-mixed colour to create a very definite, sharp or clear mixture on the surface of the canvas. In other cases, I'm wanting the colours to mix. I made a little bit of a blip there. So managing the mixing of the colour is something that we'll discuss as you work. So I'm going from that broader blocking in, and now I want to put on some smaller, lighter marks. And these, to a certain extent, I'm floating. So the colours, some of it is standing out on the surface. But the edge of some of these lighter shapes, I'm letting them mix with the wet paint that I've put them on top of, because that gives me a more kind of natural blending effect of the water turning white. I mean, I don't know what the technical term is for that. So I'm managing to do a lot of this with my number 1 brush, and I'm turning it, I'm holding it almost parallel to the painting. So I'm not painting like this. I'm painting with the brush held almost parallel to the surface of the painting, so that if I want to drop or float some of that colour on the surface, then the angle of the brush will make it easier just to deposit that paint. I also want to paint some lighter waves. I've made a lighter mixture. That I use this mixture here as sort of pale blue. I've now got a mixture which is titanium white with a little bit of yellow ochre in it, because I want to work with a much more, much lighter, more substantial wave. So I can put some of that colour on, and again, as I did with the brush, I can play around with making it stand out, literally like a wave on the surface, or I can work some of it in a bit so that I get those intermediary colours. And the lightest colour, this lightest effect that I'm trying to create, is actually with slightly thicker paint. It's impasto, it's sitting on the surface. And so that adds to this feeling of the light falling on the surface of the water. And then both with the brush and the pieces of card, I'm going to go on looking for a few more ways of embellishing this depiction of this body of water, this piece of sea. Sometimes there's that sort of warm, almost warm green colour that appears when the the light shines through some of the waves. I'm also going to put a bit more light onto the sand, and I'll use the card again to float that, and I probably need to do something a bit more interesting to the sky. So, of course, the challenge working with the sea is it's always moving and changing. And what I hope I've managed to demonstrate to a certain degree is how it's possible working with wet oil paint, pre-mixing the colours and starting with a structure, but then adding observations, embellishments. It's possible to deal with that changing scene and therefore capture something of the energy of the sea. By contrast, you might say that Francis Campbell Caddell, or Caddell, as I think we should say it, captures something different of the character of the sea, maybe the tranquility of the sea. He worked a lot in the Hebrides, and I think his work is characterized by a very strong design. I can almost see a kind of linear quality to these paintings of Caddell's. And to that end, I'm going to suggest that on the second day, when we're at Yellow Craigs, you begin with a line drawing of a particular view, and that you then develop that into a painting, again, a postcard study, which I'll demonstrate now, which begins with outlines. So really looking for structure and a certain order, a certain clarity to the painting. So to experiment with another approach, a contrasting approach, but still working with the sea at a different location. So the Caddell exercise begins with a couple of thumbnail pencil sketches where I've restricted myself to line. So this is a very useful way of helping you think a bit more about composition. Again, I'm working just from some photographs of Yellow Craigs. When we're out on location, I'll furnish you with a viewfinder so you can look in different directions. There will be obviously Fidra rock in front of us, and that might be a particular interest to you for composition. But I thought I'd try this one because it's got a bit more of a feeling of the bay and the curve of the beach. And by restricting myself to line, I might try a little bit of texture, perhaps because we've got all the grasses and the dunes in the foreground. And in my photograph, there are a few clouds in the sky. But as I say, I'm trying to restrict myself to lines so that I can really think about the structure of this composition. And I think with that discipline of the line only, you can think ahead about what you want to include and what you want to leave out, and so on, and then translate that into paint. So again, I'm going to work on a postcard sized study. I think that's just really useful to start the day with something small that you can really manage and you can control, and you can use significant amounts of paint. But this time I'm going to keep the white surface, and I'm going to begin with the line drawing that I worked on in pencil. I've mixed up a dark neutral, a bit of a brown from some ultramarine, and I've gone wrong already, from some ultramarine and some cadmium orange. And I want to just set out some of these main lines that I've identified through my pencil study. And then I'm going to block in colour and build up contrast through colour and tone. But this time the structure which holds my painting together, I don't know if I'll do much to the sky, but the structure which holds my painting together will come from this linear basis, this framework or foundation which I found through my line drawing. There's a certain flat, abstracted quality to Caddell's paintings, and you might want to apply paint with a brush. Possibly, when I look closely at some of his work, there's almost a slight sort of cubist quality to it, as though he's used a square brush to block in areas of colour. But equally, the card that I was demonstrating for the previous McTAGGART approach is also quite good. It certainly helps you abstract and simplify, which is always the best starting point for painting. But in either case, if you begin the day with a small study, it'll help you find your feet with the new location, and it will also actually allow us to address some of the basics of handling oil paint. Obviously working outdoors, dealing with weather conditions, but also the whole business of mixing colour, having pre-prepared colours on your palette, and then applying paint in different ways in order to achieve certain effects, and the business of floating and the like. So that's my second approach, which we'll take on day 2 when we are at Yellow Craigs near Delton. And if you would be kind enough to indulge me with a study for the first hour or so on a small scale, I think there's a lot we can cover through that, and then you can go on and work on a more sustained painting for the rest of the day, and probably on a larger scale, and looking at a variety of views and compositions. So 2 different approaches under this sort of inspiration and influence of 2 different artists. So I'll have some books, and we can talk a bit about McTAGGART and Caddell, and we can apply those approaches to our different Scottish seascape locations. Okay, so I hope the sun shines.